this is a substantially different form of trust that we form with buyers who form in a business. I'd like to say is that, buyers, they trust you enough to buy from you, but they're not going to invite you to come babysit their kids.
Yeah, well, it's a good point you raise, and I find it useful to make a certain distinction between what I call the private and what I call the personal. And the private maybe has to do with would you babysit their kids? It certainly has to do with, do you know your customers' kids' birthdays? And I think business trust has got nothing to do with that. You can do it. It's up to you. It's up to who you are and who the customer is.
Hi, friends. Welcome to the Sales Enablement Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Paul. Now, that was Charlie Green. Charlie's one of the top experts in the world on the subject of trust. He's the co-author of the classic book, The Trusted Advisor, and also author of Trust-Based Selling and the Trusted Advisor Field Book. And Charlie's joining me today on Sales Enablement, episode 775, to talk about trust. Now, trust may be the most overused and least understood word used in sales. So Charlie and I are going to try to clear up some of the mystery surrounding trust in today's sales world. We're going to dig into the difference between trust and trustworthiness and why one is perhaps more important than the other. We'll also talk about how trust building is different in the virtual age and why it's probably harder than building trust in person. And we'll also get into how much trust you really need in order to close a sales opportunity. Now, stick around for all of this. Before we get to Charlie, I want to let you know the whole team of people who work to produce this podcast are incredibly grateful for all of you who support us by listening to the show, telling your friends, sharing it on social media, and most importantly, subscribing to this show and giving us your feedback in the form of a rating and a review. So thank you. All right, let's jump into it. Charlie Green, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much, Andy. Pleasure to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. So we are recording this in the midst of uncertainty about everything in general. So how are you faring? Where are you?
I am in Boca Raton, Florida, which is all in all not a bad place to be. Good weather. We have a nice living situation, and I've been focusing on finishing up a 20th anniversary edition of The Trusted Advisor. So I got nothing else to do anyway. Doing fine.
Yeah. All right. Well, good. So you're updating a book. That's fantastic. When's that going to come out?
Oddly enough, it's due to the publisher about April 20, and they won't publish it until February of next year. I'm not sure why it takes that long, but that's what they tell me.
Yeah. Well, you have to get on the calendar for the booksellers and all that too. So, yep. Is there anybody there to receive the manuscript when you submit it?
That's a good question. I'm assuming they will be, but we'll see.
All right. So this is an appropriate topic. You're bringing up that you're updating the book, The Trusted Advisor, and we're going to talk about trust today and not just because we're in the midst of this huge, working remotely sort of exodus that's happened here in the last month, but just in general, because it's such an important topic with building a connection with somebody and doing business with them. So we'll talk about trust building in the virtual age, but I want to ask you a question first. So, yeah, there's the famous expression, people buy from people they know, like, and trust. And I guess the question is that still true in your mind?
Yeah, I don't think anything has changed from that. I mean, there are a couple tunings to that. As the world's gotten more digital, et cetera, there are certain things that we can buy without all that stuff that we didn't used to be able to. You used to worry about the interactions with the teller when you went in to cash a check. That's, I'm dating myself, obviously. ATMs blew that away. And now ATMs are getting blown away. Who needs it when you can,
online checking, right?
Right. And nobody misses that. Nobody says, oh, yeah, I used to love to go in and talk to the teller, or I used to love to go to the ATM. So things that can be digitized and automated, great. That's to everybody's plus. But what it leaves are all the other kinds of transactions, which still require some kind of human connection. B2B sales is still mostly that way. Certainly professional services sales, which is what I focus on, are that way. So the fact that we've removed the mechanizable things actually makes the remaining stuff more important. So we may spend less time with clients and customers in the sales process, but the quality and the importance of that time, I don't think has changed a bit. If anything, it's gotten higher. So I think we still buy from people what's the phrase, like, know, and trust, or
yeah, I mean, it's know, like, and trust. I think
know, like, and trust, right?
though there's some argument which order it goes in. So
Yeah.
I think like, know, trust is probably better. But so I agree with you. I think that whatever we consider trust to be in the virtual world is actually becoming more important. So I guess the question, one thing that I've been thinking about a lot and reading a lot about recently is do we really understand what this trust is, right? Because is it really trust as we sort of think we know it is, or is it really the quality of being trustworthy that is really the key thing here?
Thank you for raising that question. What I've kind of figured out after, good setup. Trust is one of those things. I analogize it to the old Potter Stewart Supreme Court Justice definition of obscenity, where Stewart famously said, "I don't know how to define it, but I know it when I see it."
Right.
And he was absolutely right. What he meant was it is contextual. And I would argue when it comes to trust, we all know what it means and what it is, but we struggle with the language for it. And the language has been confusing. So, for example, if you just think about it for a second, trust is the end result of an interaction between two parties, or it's the relationship between two parties. And those parties are asymmetric. There's a trustor and a trustee. So the defining element of the trustor, it's the first one to move. It's the one who takes a risk to initiate a trust relationship. The trustee is the person that we apply the adjective trustworthy to, or not trustworthy. So trustor takes a risk. Trustee shows up and they either are or they are not trustworthy. If they are, boom, click, the relationship kicks to a higher level of trust. So when you say, I mean, the important thing is don't confuse trust with either trusting or being trustworthy. Trust is the end result of an interaction between somebody who's trusting and another one who is trustworthy.
Okay.
That cuts through a lot of stuff. I mean, most of what we read in the press, Edelman Trust Barometer, all that stuff is about trust, but it doesn't tell you where the issue is. You know, if we have low trust, like in banking, is that because banks have become less trustworthy? Well, if you're thinking about Wells Fargo, yes, it is. But if you're thinking about have people become less trusting of banks, well, that's an entirely different question.
But I think it applies to the issue for sellers who are listening to the show as saying,
absolutely,
it's just part of the vernacular, right? We're building trust with this person, but maybe the perspective needs to be instead that I'm building my own trustworthiness.
Yep.
And it's never really talked about in that perspective, right? Is we just assume that we're gonna. If you read a lot of the sales training, sales books, it's like, yeah, you just get in there, you talk to the customer, you build trust. It's like, yeah, it doesn't quite work that way.
Well, you're right. It's imprecise. You do need to be trustworthy, and that is what comes to most people's minds first, and that's critically important. But you also can't forget, you can be the most trustworthy person in the world. In fact, one of the stories I'm building into the new book is a guy named Mark Hahn, used to be at Accenture. He's now big head of business development at EY. And he talks about this great client that they had. They'd done several great jobs and they really trusted him. And then they bid for a new job and they didn't get it. And Mark was very upset. He went to the client and he said, I thought you guys trusted us. What gives? And the client said, well, we do trust you. We trust you to be very smart and always have the answer. And, you come prepared. And if there's ever a discussion, a debate between your guys and our guys, you guys always win. And you know what? He says, you keep winning and we're always the one taking the risk. So I'm not sure I trust you after all. The key point there is you can't just be trustworthy. Occasionally you have to, be the one that takes a risk. Otherwise it feels unfair and we don't trust them. So salesmen have to figure out how to take a risk in their own way.
Right. But for the purpose of showing that they, if I understand your story correctly, is that trust has to be bilateral.
Yes. Good way to put it. And it has to be bilateral.
So people not only have to feel that they trust you or feel that you're trustworthy, as they also have to feel that you trust them. The buyer has to feel you trust them.
Exactly correct. It's got to be both.
See, and that's something that doesn't get talked about at all.
That's right. And yet it's sort of obvious when you put it that way, right?
Well, sure. And it sort of lines up with this whole idea of Cialdini talked about this in his latest book, Persuade, that people are more likely to like someone who they feel likes them.
Well, right. I mean, if you remember Cialdini's original book, he listed 6 or 7 factors that determine influence. The first one he talks about, and he talks about it more and more lately, is reciprocity. It's a real fundamental dynamic. How long am I going to like you if you don't like me? How long am I going to trust you if you don't trust me? That reciprocity dynamic is really profound when it comes to trust, as it is in a lot of areas.
So from a seller's perspective then, because this is, I think, is new probably for 99% of the people that are out there that are listening to this, about, you as a seller have to demonstrate trust in the buyer.
Right.
How's that manifested, and how do you build that?
That's the right question. Let's break it into sort of the quantitative, rational, behavioral components of trust,
sure.
and the emotional, interpersonal aspects. They're answers in both dimensions. If you want to take a risk in the cognitive, behavioral realm, what I suggest is what I call bring a risky gift. Right. In other words, when you're getting to know somebody, at some point early on, take a risk by speculating, suggesting, offering up a hypothesis that really is potentially value adding, but might be wrong. That part is critical. If all you're doing is throw them your latest canned white paper or your cool, nifty product, there's no risk to you, then it doesn't count. But if you're willing to say, in effect, you know what? I haven't looked at all this and we haven't explored you guys' business yet, but you know what? I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, I think this may be your big issue. Now, if you do that right, there's only 2 answers and they're both good. The first one is you guessed right. And they say, yes, if you have anything that deals with that, fabulous. Let's talk.
Yeah, great.
The other one, paradoxically, is even better. That's when they say, yeah, everybody thinks that's the problem, but no, it's this one. In which case you say, oh my God, the minute you said that, I realized that, of course you're right. Wow, tell me about that issue. And more often than not, they'll be happy to tell you about that issue because you're paying attention, you're listening, but also because you were willing to put yourself out there and appear vulnerable with an offer of help that could have been wrong. And we respect that. That triggers the reciprocity thing. So that's on the rational side. On the emotional side, even though it's harder.
Let's hang on for that for just a second before we go on, because I think maybe one way to summarize what you're talking about in terms of this idea of bring a risky gift, which is a term you use, is that you need to have a point of view as a salesperson.
Absolutely.
And this is the part that you can't be beholden to a script. You can't be locked into, hey, this customer looks just like every other customer we've had.
That's right.
You need to have a point of view, and you have to take the risk, as you said, to express it.
Exactly right. And if you can't figure out how to take that risk, you just, the sales knows well, the sales field knows well the saying of aggressively waiting for the phone to ring. Mm-hmm. You might as well be aggressively waiting for the phone to ring unless you're willing to have a point of view and put it out there and, potentially be wrong. If it's non-disconfirmable, I'll go back to my philosophy major undergrad.
Did you just make up that word?
No. It's called, it's not exactly the right word. It's called, I'm forgetting the exact word, but that's
unverifiable. Yeah.
If it's unverifiable, it's not worth anything. It doesn't say anything.
Right. Okay, so now let's go to the second part. So this was the have a point of view. So the second part's more feelings based, if you will.
Yeah, and to sum that up very simply, the best way to take a risk emotionally is to comment on the other person's feelings or on your own. You don't want to overdo your own because you run the risk of looking self-centered and narcissistic. But it's pretty no fail to, if you can do this intelligently and sensitively. By truly caring about the others, but comment on what they're feeling. Gee, you looked a little upset when I mentioned that thing. Let's put it in today's environment. We're at the early parts of the pandemic, and if you're talking on the phone with somebody and you say, how you doing? And they say, well, I just heard my brother-in-law, got diagnosed. You don't say, okay, let's move along to the subject of the meeting. And you don't say, gee, that's tough. What you do is you say, oh my God, that's got to be hard for you. Yes? And you shut up and you leave some silence. You act like a human being, like if it was your brother-in-law. What would you say? And over and over, the audiences I deal with in particular, which are professional services, so we're talking lawyers, accountants, management consultants, actuaries, architects, they're not good at this. And they're scared to death of talking about anything emotional, partly because that's who they are, partly because they don't want to look unprofessional, and they don't do that. So the admonition is that's exactly what you have to do. In fact, times like this, you need to do it even more. So
more
take
vulnerable.
emotional risk, be more vulnerable, because everybody's feeling vulnerable right now, right? And oddly enough, you look at, again, for people listening to this later, this is the context of early in the pandemic. We're seeing TV show hosts, cable news guys, we're in their bedrooms. We're looking at the books they read. We're watching, kids and dogs go by the camera.
Yeah, look at that.
There you go, right? Same here.
Yeah.
And, suddenly everybody's doing that. And we want that because now's a time of big vulnerability. So that's how you take a risk.
Well, it raises the question is what do we go back to then? Right? I mean, if this creates sort of an interesting moment in time for people to become more vulnerable, and do we become more guarded afterwards? I mean, is this what you see what happens? People will become more guarded? Or, I mean, personally, I miss maybe having the audience in the background, but I'm watching, Stephen Colbert at night from his home.
Yeah, kind of boring, right?
Well, on one hand, a little boring, but on the other hand, I watch it much more closely because
that's true.
It's more personal. Same with Jimmy Kimmel, same thing. It's just like,
true.
Oh yeah, the hair's messed up a little bit, and it's just
right. I think we're going to see some of it is going to carry over. It's the new normal. I don't think you go through an experience like this and have levels of vulnerability and then pretend it didn't happen. So I think you're going to see people staying on Zoom, not nearly as much. Well, I'll be glad to get off it. But I think some of it's going to stay. We're getting more comfortable with these forms of interactions. We're exercising our muscles for expressing social solidarity when you can't touch people or be within 6 feet of them. We're getting better at verbalizing, body language, all that stuff. Some of that I think will stay. Although reading something about the 1917 flu epidemic, apparently people just wrote it out of history. It was a bad experience nobody wanted to remember. And in fact, historians say it's very lightly treated in the history books. So,
it is. Absolutely. Yeah.
So maybe some of this and some of that.
Yeah. I mean, sort of right in the midst of, toward the end of World War I. I mean, there's lots of things going on. But yeah, it was, you don't study it in part of your history class and so on.
Right. Yeah.
I suspect this will be different.
I suspect so too.
But I mean, it's really, I just want to go back to a point before. And I think for people who are in remote selling situations, perhaps they hadn't been in before.
Right.
Is this idea of being human, which is something I write and talk about a lot, as do you.
Do. Yeah.
Is this becomes more important. Is you have to feel that you have the license to have these comments, to talk about your feelings, to comment on someone else's feelings,
right?
To connect in a way that you won't otherwise allow yourself to connect.
That's true, and we're talking about it. Everybody's talking about it. Your lives have changed. That's what's going on, and to not talk about it, increases the falsity of whatever sales dialogue you're having. You got to talk about it.
Well, and you got to talk about it authentically. I mean, a lot of what's on LinkedIn these days is this macho, keep on calling, keep on, and you and I both know people that are writing about this.
Yes,
and,
we do.
Blah, 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 blah. And it's just like, is that really the point? I mean, the point is,
it's not.
Business continues, but that's sort of unmindful of the disruption that your customers are feeling and the vulnerability they're feeling at this point in time. And everybody's got this sense of anxiety about this virus.
Right.
Is maybe that your approach is, just to be a little more human is
absolutely. It's tone deaf not to be at this point. I mean,
right. And I understand that things are going to be tough for you and maybe now's not the right time. I mean, this is to say that if you're reading some stuff online, it's like, what a bunch of wusses, right? If you start going that path, and it's like,
no.
Acknowledge reality and with the buyer and say, look, there's a way that I can stay connected and engaged with you as you go through this process on your end. Right. Where compared to other people, when you get to the end of this, you're going to think, Andy really did a great job of supporting us, and he was there for us on multiple levels.
Well, to that point, this is a time of crisis. Who gets remembered after times of crisis? Who behaves heroically? Who do we recall as having been an exemplar? And who do we not recall at all? Or worse yet, recall as a jerk?
Mm-hmm.
And, you see that among the governors right now. There's a perception coming out of who's been, on point and who's tone deaf.
Yeah.
And this is a chance to write future history. And how you behave right now is how people will remember you when all this is done. And
I think an opportunity for people to really understand this is not a way to learn how to act now,
right,
just now, but it's a way to learn how to act that will stick with you the rest of your life.
It is, and it should be, absolutely. And it's an opportunity to sort of flex those muscles at a very forgiving time. People are very accepting and even desirous of a little authenticity and reality and basic 101 level empathy. People should be availing themselves of it.
Well, I think as people now are going through, again, this remote work from home, remote selling sort of transition, I thought it'd be really useful to go back through. I love Stephen M. R. Covey's description of the 4 pillars of trust in his book, The Speed of Trust, which you and I have spoken about before.
Yeah.
And he talks about motivations, integrity, credibility, and reliability.
Right.
And I just want to sort of run through those with you because this is so important. Is when he talks about motivations being a pillar of trust building, it means, are you completely transparent in your motivations?
Right.
In your communications with your buyer.
Right.
And this is a problem in the best of times.
Yep. Correct.
And now that we're not sort of, I don't say the worst of times, but in a worse time, it becomes even more critical. And I know we all have numbers to make and goals to hit.
Yeah.
But if you try to sort of lead with, hey, we're being really empathetic with this customer, the situation they're in, and then you get to the last week of the month and you put pressure on to close a deal,
right,
your motivations are revealed.
Absolutely. Revealed for what they are, which is not client-focused, customer-centric, or any of that stuff. It was always about you, which means the change has to be fundamental. And I forget whether you and I have talked about this before, but one of the things I've been trying to articulate recently is an unconscious myth out there that the best road to short-term performance is through short-term behavior. The fact is, the best road to short-term performance, and certainly long-term performance, is long-term behavior. It's kind of self-evident to all of us. If you consistently over time behave in a customer-focused, you, not me, a kind of a generous manner, it will pay off in the long run. What we forget is the long run is made up of a series of weeks and quarters and so forth. It pays off. And if you reveal the bad intentions, and it immediately shows, oh, you're just looking for the quarterly numbers, well, guess what? You just ruined trust. So Covey's absolutely right. Yeah.
Well, the thing that I think companies and sellers miss is that sometimes you get to the end of the quarter and you make this astounding offer to somebody.
Yeah.
They see through it.
Of course they do.
But they still take it.
Well, yeah, but at what
Sometimes
price?
Sometimes they don't. Right.
Yeah.
But the price is that you're going to get high churn and those accounts are going to leave as soon as they have the opportunity.
Exactly.
Because they're opportunistic. And so I think.
And you just fed their opportunism.
That's right. People really confuse this. They think, well, of course they must trust us because, they bought. And it's like,
not the same thing. They bought because they had no other alternative better. And the minute somebody knocks 2 cents off your offer, they're going to be gone as fast as they bought your quarterly spiff.
Yeah. And I have that conversation with sales leaders and so on. It's like, have you ever calculated the ROI of doing this?
To that point,
last day of the month offer, which you would have gotten the order the next week anyway.
Right. And it's, a lot of people criticize short-term focus, but not enough. I see all kinds of sellers, marketers out there who are just blithely churning through potential leads as if they were infinite. They pay no attention to the turnoff that it creates. It's the what's left behind when Sherman's marched through Georgia, that kind of thing. You leave devastation behind you, and they don't care because what's the marginal cost of another reach out?
Well, which is interesting though too when you think about it, because I've always thought it's a myth in sales is that, you sort of, in most aspects of sales is people think, going to get my next job. I can talk about, I sold these accounts. I can have entries and, entrees into these accounts and so on not if you behave like that.
That's true.
People remember. People have long memories.
People have very long memories, right?
So the next one is integrity, which is sort of aligned with the other, is that your actions have to match your words.
Yeah. Yeah, this is one. I mean, Covey's model is very similar to mine, which is the trust equation: credible plus reliable plus intimate divided by self-orientation. The intentions is kind of like self-orientation.
Yep.
Credibility and competence we're pretty aligned with. I have stayed away from the word integrity myself just because I've never found a good definition of it. I think of it as kind of a meta level that says, does everything line up? I mean, that's actually the word of that integrity comes from: integral, whole, one part of a whole cloth. So I don't have anything to add on that word. It makes sense.
I think the thing that again, people aren't mindful, it gets back to a little bit to the motivations thing, is if you say one thing and do another.
Correct.
Then
inconsistent, hypocritical, you lack integrity.
You lack integrity. Now, most people hear the word integrity, they think it means honesty, right? And you can be above board and still lack integrity.
Yes, true. That's true.
And this is a disconnect for many sellers to hear this. It's like, well, what are you talking about?
That's right. Yeah, I agree with you. It's more than just honesty. It's the whole thing has to fit together.
Yeah, and and people sense that very quickly. It's like, oh, you just told me X, but now you're doing this. It's like, well, wait a second.
Yeah, exactly.
We're sort of lacking. Something doesn't quite add up here, and then the barriers go up.
Right. Exactly right.
Yeah, I mean, I love the expression from Emerson. The quote is, I cannot.
Your actions.
I cannot hear what you say because your actions, speak. I forget what it is, right? Your actions.
Yeah, your actions speak more loudly than the words.
Yeah, boy, I can't believe I blew that. I know that quote. I'll have to go back. The audience has heard it before.
We all know it. Yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah, I'm gonna blame it on the pandemic. So, I mean, credibility obviously is important.
Yep.
And
although I would say right now, credibility is the least important in this time, unless you're Dr. Fauci. But if you're not, lay off the credibility stuff. Well, right now, we don't want to hear your credentials. We don't want to hear your track record and how smart you are. That's not what this time is largely about. In normal times, yes, plays a big role.
Well, but also plays into trust a little bit as well.
It does. It does.
I mean, so, and then reliability, actually, I think, is very important these days.
Absolutely. Yeah. Track record, consistency. I think one of the easiest ways I always tell people to create trust is make a lot of promises and then keep them. That falls on. Reliability is also the only component of another truism of trust. Trust takes time. We hear that all the time. Mostly it does not take time. The one exception is reliability, because that does require, by definition, the passage of time over which multiple events happen.
Sure.
So that works.
But the perception of trustworthiness is part of this first impression people have of you. I mean, this comes across pretty quickly. I mean,
it really does. Yeah. In all the other dimensions, people assess your credibility very quickly, your intimacy very quickly, your self-orientation not quite so fast, but we're always looking for it.
Well, I mean, it all adds up to character to some degree.
Okay. Yes, I think so.
I mean, I think people perceive what your character is. I mean,
yes.
I've someone sort of disputed me on it once. I said, well, how often have you bought something from somebody whose fundamental character you didn't trust?
Right. Not often.
Not very often.
It reminds me, now we're throwing quotes around. I think it was George Burns said, the most important thing in life is sincerity. If you can fake that, you've got it made. And I think of that with trust too. You really can't fake trustworthiness for very long. It's going to fall apart. Somebody's going to sense it. You have to be, and that's character.
Yeah, well, it's an act that you have to maintain. It's hard to maintain that act. So,
right.
So here's a question that in this day and age where we want to measure everything is, when you're in process,
right?
Let's say in a sales situation, is how do you assess or measure the level of trust that you've built?
Right. I would argue 3 points. Number one, it doesn't matter that much. Number two, there are ways to measure the rational sides of trustworthiness. Number three, there are not particularly good ways to measure the non-rational parts. And let me start with why it doesn't matter. Why do you? First of all, you know it in your bones. And I think we need to get in touch a little bit more with our instincts, with our commonsensical feelings. The passion to measure trust comes from nothing to do with trust. It comes from a passion for measuring everything. We all live in a world where people mindlessly quote, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. That's not true on the face of it. There are 100 ways to manage without measurements. And anyway, I find that it's vastly overrated, with a couple exceptions. I know when work we do in helping big companies deal with trust, I say you should measure revenue. If you can't see an impact on the top line within 6 months, then it's not working. But beyond that, I think we get lost in metrics. Some of it is measurable. You can easily quantify and measure and track credibility. References, credentials, past work. That's fine. Reliability, even easier. It's straight up behavioral stuff. How many times did you meet your promise? What was your track record? That's not hard to do, and there's nothing wrong with doing it. But how do you measure intimacy? And how do you measure self-orientation? Some of it's even self-contradictory, because what we want to do with measurements is then use them to incent people. Well, how do you incent people to become unselfish? It falls apart, when you even think about it. So, we do want to be able to help people learn to be better, intimate, lower self-orientation, but it doesn't come about from their usual technique of management and so forth. It comes about by clearly articulating principles and providing role modeling of how to execute on those principles, which is, the way we think of much softer stuff. But, what are you trying to do? And I think the term values is appropriate here. The term principles is appropriate here. And the point is not to memorize your corporate, value statement. The point is to live it. And the role of managers is to point out, here's what that principle means in this case, and to be alert to it. That's how you teach people the softer skills.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Back to the first point about, why should people measure it? And I think that the way I've always done it is ask somebody, right? If you're asking a seller,
yeah.
So, do we have the trust of the customer or not?
Yeah, it's a simple question.
And if they don't know,
right,
then
that's an answer.
That's the answer right there. Is you have to know as a seller. You have to be very conscious of the fact is, have I done what I need to do to demonstrate the trustworthiness?
Yeah.
And part of what you talked about, which I think is very important, is also to demonstrate some level of trust in the buyer themselves.
Right.
But you should know that. If you're engaged, if you're a human being and you're just not, following a process that's been laid out by your manager saying, hell, have you migrated to the next stage or not?
Yeah.
It's like, are you aware of whether you've got the trust of the buyer?
Yeah, I think, to go way 40,000 foot level, the entire approach of Western education, including business education, is towards the analytical, the cognitive, the calculable, and we have given, paid not very much attention to, let's call it broadly, the softer skills, intuition, common sense, those sorts of things. I was struck years ago in MBA programs, you don't find a single course in selling, as in how do you stand in front of a person and become effective as a salesperson. You find tons of courses on sales management, on sales leadership. These are all things that can be reduced to cognitive rules. But you don't find anything that talks about what it takes to be a real effective salesperson. They just don't teach it because it doesn't fit in the curriculum. Well, too bad for the curriculum. You need to know it in your bones. And if you can't pick that up, you need some basic re-education. Go back to kindergarten, and relearn.
Right. Well, back to the first point about there are now some schools that are teaching salesmanship.
There are a few. You're right.
And,
You're right.
And Howard Dover at University of Texas, and
there's a guy up in
University.
There's a guy in Boston too, or New York rather.
But in general, I do like your comment because someone asked me on an interview once about, this idea about, salespeople have a hard time with some of these soft skills we talked about, and they want to know what I thought the cause of it was. And I said, bad parenting.
Yeah, true. Totally true. Reinforced by an educational system, I would add. But yeah, you're right.
So, some of these things go way back. Well, last thing I wanted to get into is, and this is something else again, is this trust we talk about. I mean, there's different types of trust, right? And so I think that maybe part of the reason people have a hard time, sellers have a hard time recognizing this and dealing with it is because they can only conceptualize this in the term of, I trust my parents, I trust my partner, I trust my whatever.
Right.
And in my mind, this is a substantially different form of trust that we form with buyers, we form in a business. I mean, I'd like to say is that, by buyers, they trust you enough to buy from you, but they're not going to invite you to come babysit their kids.
Yeah, well, here I think it's useful. It's a good point you raise, and I've always found it useful to make a certain distinction between what I call the private and what I call the personal. And the private has to do with would you babysit their kids. It certainly has to do with, do you know your customers' kids' birthdays? Do you both go out to watch the Knicks together? So, well, not the Knicks, but all the private life stuff. And I think business trust has got nothing to do with that. You can do it. It's up to you. It's up to who you are and who the customer is.
Right.
But the important part of trust is what happens within business, but is personal. Because all the personal aspects of a full human's life, ups and downs and fears and sorrows and wins and losses and aggravation and resentment and politics, all that stuff, all that happens in the business environment.
Sure.
And if you don't address the human component of that happening in the business environment, you're missing out on the trust that I'm talking about. So you can almost know absolutely nothing about a person privately in their private life. But if you forge a strong enough human connection with that person in the realm of business, that's all that's needed. And often that's all that's appropriate. That's not to say you can't have private relationships with many people. But again, that's up to you and them individually and doesn't have to do with business trust per se.
Yeah, and it gets back to this nature of what is the relationship in business that you're forming with between a buyer and a seller is because there's about 2,000.
It's both. It's commercial and it's personal if you do it right.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was Aristotle talked about, the relationship of utility, which is fundamentally what you have, right? Or he called them friendships of utility, but that's the type of relationship I believe you have with your buyers. The connection you have with your buyers is it's functional. It's here for this moment. The utility to get something done between us. It's personal, as you said. Yep. There's trust involved. It's not personal trust necessarily, though, as you said, it could extend to, but it's
private
trust.
Private
trust, excuse me.
I'd have to think more about the way you put it, but I think it's a little stronger than that. It's not like if I leave companies, goodbye you. I'm going to remember who I dealt with. And when I move to another company, I'm going to want to bring you with me if I had that kind of personal trust relationship. Again, it has nothing to do with private lives. Sure. It has a lot to do with the ability to forge a connection with that other person.
Which is what the world revolves around.
Absolutely.
I mean, as much as we try to script out the human aspect of sales out of it,
right?
I think that you've made the argument. I've made the argument that it's actually become more and more essential as we get more automated, more mechanized. What stands out about an individual is their ability to be human and to connect with another person.
Right, exactly. Now, let me ask you a question if I can.
Sure.
You and I think, have both commented on the ubiquity of emails that come in and are offering, we've got this special, deal for you. And they may or may not have done a fabulous job of targeting me. They know exactly my little business. There's some rational reason why I was picked. But the pitch itself is utterly tone deaf, completely impersonal. Drives me nuts because, anyway, what do you think of all that? Is that more systemic? Is it just me? What's going on? And are they as clueless as I think they are?
Well, they're clueless. They're lazy, basically, is what it comes down to, because the tools actually provide the ability to personalize at a scale you've never been able to do before. But most people are using the technology to automate bad behaviors. And so I get a lot of this because depending on the day, I could get up to 10 pitches in a day to be on this program. Okay, so
wow.
It's a popular show. Lots of people want to be on it.
Yeah.
And I can tell in a heartbeat who's actually listened to
exactly.
an episode.
I'm sure you can.
And it doesn't matter if they say they've listened to it and they enjoy it.
Right.
You can just tell. And
yeah, you really can. I get the same. People saying, "Oh, we'd love to guest post and link here." Nope.
Yeah, and so for me, it's a quick turnoff because it's like, I have a limited resource here.
Right.
You want people that have been sincere.
Yeah.
Sincere in their interest that they want to be on it and that they have something they think is unique to share.
Right.
And if it's just like, I just want to be on show to be on a show, it's like, we're not interested.
We're not doing that.
It comes across in the pitch.
Yes, exactly. Well, thank you for that.
Yeah, okay. Well, good. Anything else I can do for you?
Nope, we're good.
All right. Well, Charlie, we've sort of run out of time, but as always, it's been fantastic to talk
As
with
always,
you.
thank you. Thank you, Andy. Really appreciate it, always.
If people want to get in touch with you, what should they do?
The easiest is the website, trustedadvisor.com. That's spelled with an O-R, trustedadvisor.com. And you'll find email, phone, and everything within there.
And it's a great book to read if you haven't read it, The Trusted Advisor, but wait for the new version?
Nope, don't wait. Well, I am both. What can I say? It's a while yet.
Well, and you also have the Trusted Advisor sales book, right?
We have the Trusted Advisor field book, and let's not forget Trust-Based Selling, my personal favorite in many ways.
Yeah. Also, a good book. I've read 2 of those. So, all right. Recommend them. Charlie, great to see you as always. Stay safe.
Thank you, Andy. Likewise. Take care.
Okay, friends, that's it for this episode. First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. I'm so grateful for your support of the show. I also want to thank my friend, Charlie Green, for sharing his wisdom with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to this podcast, Sales Enablement with Andy Paul, on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to this podcast. And if you could also leave us a rating or a review and let us know how we're doing, we'd really appreciate it. You can do all that on your phone in less than a minute as soon as this show is over. So thanks for your help. And thank you for investing your time to join me today. Until next time, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.